Dan stood on the edge of an old flooded ravine, staring at the half-sunken car body. The dirty water shimmered in the evening sun like it was mocking him. The car's roof stuck out from the water, an old barge, clearly from the 60s. It was a 1967 Cadillac, or rather what was left of it. Rust, moss, and oil stains on the surface. But to Dan, it wasn't just a bucket of bolts. It was a memory of his grandfather, the same man who once roamed the county in his black Cadillac like he was riding a royal throne. Everyone respected him. Everyone but one, Dan's brother. "You seriously want to pull out this hearse?" Mark's voice, his brother, already sounded annoyed. "That junk's been dead for years, just like Grandpa. Let it go." Dan clenched his fist but said nothing. Mark had hated the Cadillac since childhood. He saw it as a symbol of the past that tore their family apart. When their grandfather died, the first thing Mark did was sell off the old garage where the car used to sit, and the car itself supposedly disappeared. Only later did Dan find out it had been dumped in the river. He'd come here 3 days in a row, checking to see if the river had carried off what was left, and today the roof was still poking out. "I don't care what you think, Mark," Dan muttered to himself. "I'm bringing it back. Piece by piece, bolt by bolt, I'll bring it back." Fixing old cars wasn't just a hobby for Dan, it was a lifeline. He worked as a mechanic, rebuilding other people's engines, but had always dreamed of restoring something of his own, not some 2005 Toyota, a legend. The 1967 Cadillac was the perfect candidate. Not just a classic, but personal history. And that's why he could never forgive his brother for making it disappear. Now, everything made sense. The car was sunk to erase the past, but he'd do the opposite, raise it to bring back the respect for their roots. That same evening, Dan called his friend Tim, a former crane operator who had an old Soviet manipulator crane in his yard. "Tim, I need your help. It's gonna be wet, dirty, and illegal. So, just the way we like it," Tim laughed. "What are we pulling?" "A Cadillac. From a river. Almost whole. Almost..." By morning, they were knee-deep in mud. Dan in waders, Tim in sneakers like an idiot. "You didn't tell me it was actually in the water," Tim grumbled, surveying the situation. "I thought you liked surprises," Dan replied, fastening the cable to the roof arch. The metal creaked under tension but held. Tim started the winch. The hook tightened. The dirty water foamed, and the car jerked with a groan. After decades in the river, it had become part of the mud and roots like concrete. But the cable held. Slowly, with heavy creaks, the Cadillac began to rise into the light. No wheels, hood torn off, but the body intact. No huge dents. This was a chance. When the car was finally on shore, both men fell silent. Half the doors were bent out of shape. The interior was full of silt, algae, and even a dead snake. But the frame was alive. The chassis was intact. "You're insane," Tim said, "but I envy you." "Because I found something worth fighting for," Dan replied, eyes locked on the car. That same evening, with the Cadillac already on the trailer, Mark showed up at Dan's property. He walked up silently, without a greeting, and stared at the rusty body for a long time. Then he said, "You're making a mistake. This car ate our father's life. First Grandpa, then Mom, then you. Let it go. Or maybe you're just scared I'll bring back what you tried to destroy," Dan answered. They stared at each other in tense silence. Then Mark turned around and left without saying another word. Dan was left alone. He walked up to the car and ran his finger along the roof. Under the rust was the old paint, a faded black. But he already knew, when he was done, it would be a new black, deep as night, with shine, with pride. He wasn't just restoring a car, he was restoring respect for a memory they tried to erase. Dan sat in the garage, staring at the dirty, time-worn body of the Cadillac. After drying, the car looked even worse than it had in the water. The metal was rotted through in many places, the headlights were barely holding on, and the interior, it simply didn't exist. The water had done its job, the wooden trims had swollen and crumbled, the seats had turned to rot, and the wires into a rusty cobweb. Dan wiped his forehead, leaving a black streak of oil. "So, where do I even begin?" He took apart the engine bay. The engine was in terrible shape, but not hopeless. It needed a complete rebuild. Luckily, some parts were compatible with other GM models, and Dan found a 472 engine at a salvage yard across town. He spent his last money to get it. While the engine waited for a rebuild, Dan began welding the body. He worked at night, alone, to the sound of old rock playlists, with the smell of burning metal in the air. He had to learn from YouTube. He'd never done bodywork before. But day by day, the shape began to reappear. Where there were holes, there were now patches. Where the rocker panels had rotted away, there were new profiles. After a few weeks, Dan decided to show his brother what he'd been working on. "Mark, come over. I want to show you something." "Is this about that junk heap of a car?" His brother's voice was sharp. "You're seriously wasting your time." "Just come." Mark showed up reluctantly. He stepped into the garage, looked for a few seconds, and snorted. "This is a massive waste of resources. There's nothing sacred in this pile of scrap, and you know it." Dan clenched his jaw. "To you, it's just metal. To me, memories. It was the only thing Dad didn't sell before he died." "Maybe because it wasn't worth anything," Mark said coldly and walked out. That conversation only added fuel to the fire. Dan made up his mind he would finish it no matter what. The next few weeks, he worked on the wiring, replaced almost the entire harness, built the instrument panel by himself, installed seats from another Cadillac, but reupholstered them in vinyl to keep the original style. The melody of the old car was slowly coming back to life, but there was still a long way to go. The final blow to his motivation came when the paint shop refused the job. "This kind of car isn't worth painting. Who's gonna buy it later?" the owner said. Dan just shrugged. "I'm not selling it, I'm bringing it back to life." And he picked up a spray can, then a second, then 5 more. At night, under the light of lamps, he painted the body himself black on black, several layers polished by hand. It wasn't a perfect job, but the car looked like it had never been underwater. And then came the day to start the engine. "All right, girl." Dan sat in the driver's seat. "The key. Turn." The engine coughed. Once, twice, and came alive, roughly, with strain, but it ran. Dan closed his eyes. He hadn't even realized he was holding back tears from exhaustion, from joy. He did it. The car was ready. The black, shiny, menacing Cadillac stood in the garage, its engine quietly purring at idle. Every part was in place, the interior restored, the headlights shone like new. But inside, Dan didn't feel calm. He knew a conversation with his brother was coming, and it was going to be tough. The next day, Dan drove out of the garage. The Cadillac gently rocked on its springs and confidently surged forward. People on the streets turned to look, some even filmed on their phones. The old American beast was alive again. He headed straight to Mark's house. When he pulled up, his brother was already standing at the gate, arms crossed. His expression was sour. "Are you serious?" Mark asked coldly, staring at the car. "Very," Dan replied calmly. "It deserved a second chance. And if you want to know, this was the best project of my life." Mark stepped closer. For a few seconds, he silently examined the car, then walked around it, peeked inside, ran his finger along the hood. "It's like new," he muttered under his breath. "Not like new, better," Dan said with a faint smile. "Why'd you do it, huh?" Mark snapped. "Aren't there enough other cars for you? This damn Cadillac. You know what we went through, what Dad went through with it." Dan gripped the steering wheel. "Exactly," he said firmly. "This car is part of our history. I don't want the past to rot underwater. I want us to remember. I want Dad to be proud." Mark turned away sharply. A few seconds of silence. Only the soft hum of the engine in the background. "You know," Mark finally said, "if you had asked me, I would have forbidden you to do this." "I know," Dan nodded. "That's why I didn't ask." They stood silently next to the car. Mark clenched his fists as if struggling with something inside. Then he stepped back. "I hope you know what you're doing," he said, and walked away. Dan was left alone. He started the engine. The Cadillac growled softly, like a predator ready to leap. He looked in the mirror, saw his brother walking away, and suddenly felt like this wasn't the end. Something felt wrong. The next morning, Dan woke up earlier than usual. The sky was covered with gray clouds. The air smelled of dampness and ozone. He sat in the kitchen for a long time with a mug of coffee without turning on the light. Mark's words were echoing in his head, as if he were still standing there. "You know what we went through." He got into the Cadillac and drove, not knowing where exactly. He just drove. The street slowly passed by, raindrops beginning to tap against the windshield. He turned on the radio, but there was only static. The silence felt louder. He stopped by the old house where their parents had lived. It had been empty for years. The curtains in the windows had yellowed, the mailbox was rusting. But this is where it had all begun, and this is where it had ended. Dan got out, walked around the car, and sat on the porch. A strong wind blew leaves off the road, sending them spinning in a swirl. He pulled a photograph from his pocket, his father, young, a cigarette in his teeth, leaning against this very Cadillac, smiling. Behind him, Mom smiling too, but a little more sadly. "I did it," Dan said quietly. "I wanted you to be proud. Or maybe I just wanted to be proud myself. I don't even know anymore." He ran a hand over his face and closed his eyes. The sound of tires moving startled him. The Cadillac had slowly begun to roll down the slope. The handbrake, he hadn't pulled it. "No, damn it!" Dan shouted, jumping off the porch. The car was rolling backward, straight toward the steep drop, beyond which was the river. The same river. Dan only managed to grab the door handle before the car picked up speed and, breaking through the overgrowth, disappeared below with the dull sound of twisting metal and a splash of water. He ran down the slope, grabbing at branches, tripping over rocks. When he reached the riverbank, it was already too late. In the murky water, only a piece of the roof was still visible, slowly sinking beneath the surface. The bubbles were getting fewer and fewer. He fell to his knees. The car had gone back to where he'd pulled it from, as if it had taken with it everything he'd lived for these past months. Everything he had repaired, built, assembled, gone in a matter of seconds. The rain grew heavier. He sat in the mud, soaked to the bone, clutching the photograph, which was also soaked and starting to fall apart in his hands. Footsteps approached from behind. "I saw you speeding down the highway," Mark said, coming closer. "Thought I'd catch up to you, but I guess it doesn't matter now." Dan didn't turn around. "It's gone," he whispered, "just like he is." Mark crouched beside him. For several minutes, they said nothing, just listening to the rain and the river. "He'd still be proud," Mark finally said. "Not because of the car, because you didn't give up, not once." Dan nodded. His lips were trembling, but not from the cold. "I don't know what to do now." "Live, I guess," Mark said softly, "and build something new, together." They stayed by the water for a long time. The rain didn't stop, but somewhere in the downpour, a faint light was beginning to appear,